This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a distinguished Professor Emeritus of Communication and Science Studies at the University of California, San Diego, a world-renowned expert on the history of technology and materiality, who happens to be in Israel this week, and we're here to discuss her forthcoming book, Reimagining Modernity. Professor Chandra Mukerji, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, nice to be here.
Thank you very much for coming. So, modernity, as you say in your book, is like a braid with many strands composing it. What would you say are really the most essential tenets of modernity? How would you define it for the purposes of our discussion?
Well, I think that what was unusual about what I developed in this book was the idea that modernity is born of grief, that most people assume that the modern world was either the product of capitalism or the product of Enlightenment values, and that it didn't exist prior to something like the 18th century. But I follow the historians who said that the modern world began with the plague. And so I begin with loss and grief and an inability to go forward.
With the plague meaning the Black Death of the 14th century.
Yeah, right. And so all of modernity changes when you take it back that far.
It's also a big difference between the 14th century and, I don't know, even the 16th century, which is, to the best of my knowledge, the earliest cutoff point between the Middle Ages and modernity. But I mean, if you look at the history of the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries, I mean, it requires a lot in terms of looking at it to make that distinction.
Okay. So you want to know what I think what makes the difference? What's the distinction? I think it's the development of a modern self, which is a kind of individual who is self-fashioning, who imagines a future, who can make a self, who can claim an identity and try and make those claims come true, who has a future and sees himself or herself as moving in history, stepping forward, and responsible for the consequences of his or her decisions. And that, I think, begins when people no longer have their families and their communities around them after so much death.
Yeah,
that you have
because the Black Death was really a radical change to the way people lived.
Yes, absolutely. It was for the people in the southern part of Europe, where you had 90 to 95% of the population dying. They lost whole crafts. They lost whole families. They lost the people who knew how to harvest and process the things of the field. And so what they had known as a way of life was no longer conceivable. And in most of Europe, 60% of the population died on average. And in that context, you have people who have to constitute themselves anew. And I think the thing about modernity is that it has continued to be destructive and create environments in which people have to reinvent themselves. So if you look at the kinds of things that people talk about as, sort of the bringing of modernity into the third world through colonialism, that's destroying an old way of life in order to produce a new one. And so modernity in some ways repeats these patterns of destruction, grief, reinvention, and continues to do that into the present. And I think it's really a mistake to think of modernity being a set of idealistic principles about, self-governance.
Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment.
Because it had to come from somewhere. I mean, I think that really that's the force of your argument here, that capitalism and Enlightenment didn't just come out of nowhere. They had really a historical grounding.
Right, yes. That the idea, in some ways, the idea of capitalism is that you can transform the material conditions of your life and that of other people through investment and manufacture and trade and
how do you go about studying it? I mean, the way that people, as you said, became more self-fashioning. It's a very individual perspective to take. How do you do it? I mean, it's really a methodological question here when coming to study individuals in the 14th and 15th centuries.
Well, it's the reason why I moved modernity back to that period. I had read that the fashion system began in the 14th century, and I said, why? Mm-hmm. Right? What does it mean that individuals start to wear not the clothes of their occupation or their office or their social rank, begin to put on things that are inappropriate, that are making social claims about who they are? They're literally self-fashioning in the 14th century. And so you look at what they're doing with their clothes. Very successful merchants and artisans are putting on red clothes and gold clothes and kinds of things that are only supposed to be for the nobility and clergy. And so instead of accepting their position as fundamentally inferior as a kind of moral rank from these social superiors, they claimed the same kind of importance and standing. And of course, they were the people who were able to begin to build a capitalist economy. They were the ones who were beginning to create trade. They saw themselves as a kind of avant-garde standing for the future. And in that circumstance, they began to see themselves as having just as much social importance as the people who were their traditional betters. And that seemed to me such a modern thing, where you claim an identity by putting on the appropriate clothing and then going out on the street and trying to make that personality work in a kind of social environment.
What did it do to religion? I mean, it was really all-encompassing at the time, and that started changing around about the same time.
Yeah, no, I think the roots of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation are there as well, because people are dying no matter what their religious rank. Petrarch, who was, working with the Pope in Avignon as his patron, the Pope fled instead of taking care of his flock, and Petrarch writes, with an acid pen about what a venal and unhonorable man this so-called Pope was. So you have this new sense of morality, which is to say that people are responsible for their own moral standing, that they can't rely on the church to tell them whether they're moral or not. And so, if you read Boccaccio, if you read the Decameron, the stories are all, and these are from the period of the plague, right? Petrarch writes, when the plague is coming through. Same thing with Boccaccio. In the Decameron, there are all of these stories of people who either are inwardly noble and spiritual and good, or they are not. And so this idea that people have personal responsibility for their identity, it's not just that they can put on clothes.
Do you think that these people, I don't know if Boccaccio and Petrarch specifically, but people around that time, intellectuals, people who were engaged in writing, did they realize that they were at the dawn of a new era?
Well, it's hard to tell. I think yes and no. I think Petrarch had a very strong sense of entering into history because he was reading classical texts, and he wrote this note to the future where he describes himself as already dead and how people can think about him after his death. That takes a kind of future orientation, a much more modern sense of time and place than people before. So that sense that you live in history and what the future will be is not necessarily what the past is going to be like. The plague really creates that sense. I mean, you can't rely on the past to be the same. Something else is going to happen. And the question is, what is your position in that world? And so Petrarch is very interested in saying, what kind of a moral being can you be to step forward knowing that you will be judged by history, knowing that you're a member of sort of part of humanity and you will be judged as a human being and not necessarily by your station or your your
Is
social
that
importance.
also where the Renaissance state of mind came from? I mean, the fact that you actually can play with temporality, with chronology, is that the same thing?
Well, partially. I mean, I think in the Renaissance you have a continuation of this culture, but there is an interesting change from my point of view because calculation becomes so important to the Italian Renaissance. This idea, I mean, it becomes much more capitalistic. So the beginning of this is pre-capitalist. By the time you get to the 16th century, you have real places of capitalist investment and trade and calculation, political calculation with Machiavelli, right? Calculation in, shifts in bookkeeping for trade, the development of forms of art that's very attentive to qualities of objects that make them valuable trade goods. So the emphasis on form, mass is really looking at how you judge what's coming off of a ship. It's the quality of the materials, but also how much. And so there's a kind of calculating culture that you see in the Italian Renaissance that you don't quite see in that earlier period. But the idea of being people living in history, that you can't rely on the future to be like the past, that's all the same. And people self-inventing.
Mm-hmm. Another element in your book that you discuss is really the emergence of categories and how we categorize the world in modernity. Now, race and gender is, a couple of famous examples. But one thing that really caught my attention was also this is when the category of childhood emerged.
Right.
What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was something surprising and interesting to me because if you look at cultural studies, being concerned about sort of the power of categories for gender and race is conventional. But I was interested in the race and gender were qualities of people that were naturalized, or people tried to naturalize the differences among groups. And it never worked completely. Racial categorization, always contested. Gender categorization, always contested. Childhood was naturalized successfully. So by the 20th century, you have children being developmental children. They have stages, and what they are when they begin their lives is different than what they are when they leave childhood and enter into adulthood. And no one questions that it's a natural progression, except teachers who see children not progressing along this one continuum. Mm-hmm. So you talk to educational philosophers and they say, no, it's actually not that way. But it's a very successful naturalization.
But why did it start at around that time that you point to?
Well, childhood begins in the Renaissance. It doesn't start with the 14th century.
Oh, okay.
So it's a little bit different because that's the point at which elites are starting to be literate, and children are seen as not full adults because they can't be literate elites. And so childhood begins as a kind of deficit, right, with the Renaissance. But the deficit is seen as cultural. They don't have the skills they need to act like good members of court society because they haven't read the things they should and blah, blah.
Right.
So childhood transforms and starts to get naturalized in the 17th century because you begin to get this with court society. Children start being seen as not simply small adults. They're seen as disruptive to adult society, dangerous to the polite surface of everyday life. They can have a temper tantrum. They can get all dirty and, whatever, do those childish things. And so children begin to get naturalized as something other than adults in that early period. But then you get Rousseau and the Enlightenment, and he really articulates this idea that childhood is this period with Emile, the book Emile, where this young man, Emile, is getting trained to be a different kind of adult because he is naturally different than adults. But at this point, adults are to Rousseau corrupt, and in some ways they're dangerous to children. So childhood becomes a protective status,
right,
and a place in which you can not only acquire the attributes of an adult, which is what people were worried about before, but also acquire attributes that would make for a better kind of adult than the adults that had existed before. Mm-hmm. And that's much more of what we think of as modern childhood, that the next generation is going to be better than the present generation, and we'll give them all of these educational toys and read to them a lot, and they're going to be, they're going to be much better than us. But what's extraordinary is that when you get child development in the 20th century, you look at those theories, and childhood is this movement from primitive to modern, right? That children begin their lives as primitive babies, and all they can do is flail their arms and cry.
So it's like a microcosm of humanity at large.
Yeah. And it's interesting because in some ways it's an assumption that modern is better. And what primitive is like a child. So there is a way in which the naturalization of childhood is also the naturalization of this vision of human evolution and continual improvement away from the primitive others to something superior and more wonderful. And so children become in some ways responsible for a cultural myth that's very deep and very important to modernity. In their lives, they have to live out that mythology, which I just found when I started looking at that. I thought, oh, my God, good thing I did this after I raised my children. I wouldn't know what to do.
It's really fascinating. But fast forward to today, what really are the remnants of this cultural revolution that you focus on? Are there any things that we still do today that are really direct continuation of that kind of modernity that started in the 14th century?
Absolutely, yeah. One of the things I got interested in that made me think about modernity was looking at contemporary forms of popular culture that really evoke some of these qualities. And so I spent a period of time, in part as a result of working with graduate students who were interested in digital culture.
At least they didn't interest you for your study about childhood.
No. Now, actually, it's interesting. It didn't come that way, but yeah, it could. But I got interested in digital games, and I have, a smartphone and tablet full of games that my various students have tried to teach me how to play. And
I hope that they got the acknowledgements in the book.
Yes, they do. They're wonderful.
But what really are video games? What do they reflect for the purpose of your study?
Well, for me, they're training in being the kind of modern self. They are, because what you do when you play one of those games is you create a future, right? You create an avatar, which is like or pick an avatar, which is to say it's like putting on your costume, right? So it's that kind of modern self. And then you go into the future. And the future in the games that I'm interested in are paths. And the structure of the games are mazes. So people practice living a life in a structure that they don't control, which is modern life. Right? They have to go forward. And people work hard to get better and to get farther and reach new levels. So all of this thing about measured success, standards of success, all of those qualities get structured into the game so that kids who play them all the time are interested in sort of acquiring those skills that they need to become modern adults.
Yeah. How very interesting. I'm afraid this is all we have time for, so we'll have to wrap up. But thank you very much for coming in today, Professor Chandra Mukerji, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Communication and Science Studies at the University of California, San Diego, and the author of the forthcoming book, Reimagining Modernity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our trusted sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. And of course to Noah Efron, a friend of the podcast, who made this interview possible. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
רציתי שתדעי שלפעמים אני דפוק, אני יודע מתעצבן, לוקח את הרגליים ונוסע אני יודע שלא הכל אצלי ורוד ולפעמים הכוונה שלי מתפספסת שני גם את לא רק תותים וקצפת לא מסוגל